This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 13. William Cecil. William Cecil, who is better known as Lord Burghley, the title he took after clinching his great success in the middle of his career, was the author of Protestant England. One might almost call him the creator of modern England as a whole, for he stands at the root of the Church of England, the typical central religious institution following on the English Reformation. And it was under his rule the seeds were sown of all that later developed into what is now the English political and social system. It has often been remarked that England, more than any other European country, is cut off from her past. When England became Protestant, she became a new thing, and the old Catholic England of the 1,000 years before the Reformation is to the Englishman after the Reformation, a foreign country. Now, the true artisan of that prodigious change was William Cecil, Lord Burghley. Thomas Cromwell was the man who achieved the breach with Rome, and who launched England out onto the beginning of the adventure. But William Cecil was the man who, by his own genius, and that of his son Robert, did the essential work of changing England from a Catholic to a Protestant country. It was he who eradicated the faith from the English mind. It was he who prevented the succor of Catholic England by the power of Catholic Europe outside. It was he who instituted and maintained a reign of terror, the long endurance of which at last crushed out the mass from English soil. The false official history which has been taught so long ascribes what was really the action of Burghley to Queen Elizabeth. A false legend has been created with the object of exalting the character of that unhappy and distorted woman, but in truth she was but a figurehead, and it was William Cecil who during her reign molded events to his will. He was a very great political genius. The genius was set in a despicable character, mean, sly, avaricious, and thoroughly false. Morally, he was a shriveled soul, corresponding to his little wizened body and face, but intellectually he was of the highest stature. To that unique intelligence of his was added an untiring industry and prodigious memory, which between them left him in the period of his rise in power without a rival. For he was in the midst of men bent upon the loot of the church, upon pleasure, upon intriguing for places at court, for salaries, and for fragment after fragment of the royal fortune which they were dilapidating. None of them did any work, unless it could be called work to pursue such ends. William Cecil worked all his life with an iron will and a grasp of detail unparalleled in his time and hardly equaled before or since. He also had an invincible tenacity, pursuing an original plan unswervingly and molding it to any passing event. He had a profound knowledge of men, choosing his servants with skill and playing upon the weaknesses of all around him. He acted admirably. He could nearly always take a victim in, and the old fox, as they nicknamed him towards the end of his career, won nearly every conflict in which he was engaged. He was without joy, and one may fairly say, without religion. His motive was not hatred of the Catholic Church, such as we find in Cranmer, or in his own servant and head spy Walsingham, the chief of his intelligence department. He destroyed the Church in England because he desired to confirm his own wealth and that of the clique of which he was the head, the new millionaires who had risen up upon the booty of the ministries, of the monasteries, the bishoprics, and all the rest. He himself was not, oddly enough, a direct thief of church land. The huge fortune of the Cecils, which has kept them an important family even to this day, came from the betrayal of colleagues, the enjoyment of lucrative posts, and all that can be done by unscrupulous men in power to their own enrichment. The lands they held were largely church lands, but at second hand. The Cecils had no considerable grant that I can remember out of the original loot, yet were they, and William Cecil their founder, the typical and representative heads of all that new wealth which arose on the ruins of religion in England. William Cecil, like Gardiner, of middle-class rank by birth, his father was what we should call today a permanent official in the government service. That is, he held a post in the establishment of Henry VIII. William's grandfather, the father of the official, had kept a hotel in Stamford, which is a town standing on the great Roman road running north from London, It is about 90 miles from the capital. Close to Stamford town, on the hill to the south of it, was the convent of Burghley, out of the ruins of which was later erected the magnificent palace which the family still holds, and from which William Cecil took his title. Henry VIII's official put the lad to Cambridge when he was 15 years of age, just after Thomas Cromwell had broken with the papacy. He did not rise very rapidly. He was nearly 30 before the father of his second wife introduced him to the Protestant protector Somerset, the uncle of Edward VI, and the man who attempted to impose Calvinism upon England during that little prince's brief reign. He became Somerset's secretary, knowing all his secrets and keeping all his papers. Then came his chance. After he had been secretary to Somerset for rather less than 2 years, another member of the gang, who were running the unfortunate little child king, to wit, Dudley, plotted to make himself supreme and to oust Somerset. Somerset, in his peril, turned to his secretary and was aghast to find that he had been betrayed. The details of the betrayal we do not know, but we do know that William Cecil suddenly jumped from a good, moderate position of what we should call today perhaps £800 a year to very great wealth. And what is more, his patron, to whom he had betrayed his old master, made him secretary to the council. That is, made him the man who kept all the state papers and knew all the state secrets. In that position, his wealth, of course, continued to increase. Although he had conspired against Mary with the rest of the council, he managed to save himself. He outwardly conformed to the national religion during the Catholic Queen's reign, and he used to make a parade of carrying an enormous pair of rosary beads to emphasize his zeal. Then, when Mary died in 1558, it was he who got Elizabeth onto the throne, and she remained for the next 20 years, wholly dependent upon his vast political capacity. It was he who suggested the gradual plan for ousting the Catholic hierarchy, and who saw to it that a secret committee should frame the new religion, at the head of which he put as archbishop an old Cambridge friend, companion, and dependent of his, Parker. His subtlety in gradually derailing England from her Catholic course was amazing. He found in these first years of his power a country the whole bulk of which was still entirely Catholic in practice, daily habit, and tradition. He could not challenge directly a force of that kind, but he undermined it. He played the card of national feeling. He relied upon Philip of Spain, the chief Catholic champion, to plead with the Pope that the new English Church was, after all, tolerable, and that the schism might not be permanent. Meanwhile, he prevented any direct action on the part of the Pope in England, and he prevented a nuncio from landing. Though the first laws had been passed making the worship in all the parish churches that of the new Anglican establishment, yet the authorities winked at a large amount of toleration, going slowly in order to do their work more thoroughly later on. Men would take communion in the Anglican form, and later take it in the Catholic form from the hands of the same parish priest, and Cecil boasted that no man suffered on account of his religion, only for treason to the state. Throughout his life, he continued to play that card of national feeling as the strongest he had in his game against Rome. Meanwhile, though openly the ally of Spain, and even dependent upon Spain for maintaining Elizabeth's insecure position, he was working underground to produce an ultimate rupture with Spain. And his genius was never better shown than when, on the pretext of protecting them from piracy, and also of examining into the credentials of the bullion they had on board, he detained in English ports the Spanish ships which had taken refuge there from pirates, while on the way to carry the pay to the Spanish king's soldiers in the revolted Netherlands. Cecil had calculated that Spain dared not fight, since she needed England, small and weak though England then was, as an ally against France. It was taking a big risk, for if Philip had then declared war, Cecil's game would have been ruined. But Spain did not declare war, and friendship was openly maintained between the two crowns, though from that moment Philip of Spain knew that Cecil was working against him. The Spanish effort in the Netherlands was hamstrung by this cutting off of supplies, and meanwhile the principal leaders of the old Catholic nobility in England were goaded into rebellion. They rose in the 10th year of Cecil's power, and that was Cecil's opportunity which he himself had created. The Catholic rebellion was put down with ghastly ferocity. drowned in blood, and Cecil could henceforward make use of the plea that attachment to the universal religion of Christendom was treason in any subject of Elizabeth's. The plots for the re-establishment of Catholicism, and therefore for the destruction of Elizabeth, Cecil watched, discovered, and nourished under his extraordinarily efficient spy system, at the head of which was, as we have seen, his man Walsingham. The most famous example of his ability in this line was his catching of John Hawkins, the pirate and slave dealer, the man who was the teacher of Drake, and, with Drake, the best seaman of his time. Cecil found Hawkins negotiating secretly with the King of Spain. Having so discovered him, Hawkins' life was in Cecil's hands, and Cecil compelled him to act as an agent and to continue to pretend to be Philip's friend and to continue his correspondence with Spain. In this way, Cecil discovered all that Philip was doing. Next, he patronized Drake, always disavowing the piracies and murders of that buccaneer, apologizing to Spain for the outrages, and even sometimes giving restitution, but all the while supporting Drake underhand and allowing him a small percentage of his loot by way of pay. He sheltered Drake from the most obvious consequences of his crimes, particularly in the case of the odious murder of Doughty, for he knew now, though it was long hidden, that it was Cecil who prevented the prosecution of Drake by the Doughty family when they clamored for justice. Meanwhile, of course, open persecution of the Catholic faith in England could, on the pretext of the recent rebellion, be launched. The old nobility, at the head of which was the Duke of Norfolk, were humbled, and the young Duke himself, though an ardent Protestant, was lured into a position where Cecil, feigning the deepest friendship for him, could bring him to the scaffold, which he did. From that moment, 1572, Cecil was supreme. He was at the height of his great powers, a man just over 50, and completely dominating the sickly and chafing queen, in whose name he acted. The persecution grew more intense until it was what I called it, a reign of terror. But all the time, Cecil, working hard upon the natural patriotism of England and insisting that he was only preserving the integrity and independence of the realm, maintained that the shocking executions and universal system of suppression and secret police work were not religious in motive, but only political. He kept to his formula that no man suffered for religion, but only for treason. He exactly judged the moment when the weakness of France, through the religious war which had broken out in that country, would permit him to defy Spain and to emphasize the now thoroughly Protestant character of the English government. By the prevention of any educational facilities on the Catholic side, by the putting off all offices, academic or of magistracy or of the executive, into the hands of his creatures, he began breeding up a whole generation of young Englishmen in whom a strong minority, gradually turning into a majority, were opposed to the faith. Yet, throughout the business, he kept the average Englishman bewildered as to whether it really were a fight between Catholicism and its enemies, or only between England and her political opponents. When he had already grown old, and had begun to introduce his second son, Robert, whom he had carefully trained in statecraft, and who was his father's equal in brains and energy, to the conduct of public affairs, came the test of the Armada. Had the Armada succeeded, there would have been, of course, a great Catholic rising, which could not have failed to be successful. Elizabeth would, without doubt, have yielded to her natural inclination and followed the Catholic desires of her people. Cecil would have fled if he had been able, or had he not been able, would have been killed. But the Armada failed, and with its failure, Cecil's great experiment took root and was founded for good. He was then a man of nearly 70. Not long afterwards he died. That second son of his, as astute as his father, was a dwarf and hunchback with an enormous head, inheriting from his father and continuing the excellent spy system which was the basis of their power. He completed the work. This Robert Cecil, who was later made Lord Salisbury, lived to see the tide turned. He may not have actually launched, but he certainly knew all about and nursed the gunpowder plot, and his triumph on that occasion settled the collapse of the faith in England. Henceforward, those in sympathy with Catholicism in varying degrees, and ardent Catholics were already a minority, were divided among themselves. It was the better part of a lifetime since the Mass had been forbidden in England. The heroic efforts of the Jesuits to create a reaction had failed, and though in mere numbers those who opposed the Catholic Church were not a large majority, they gave the tone to the whole. England, between 1605 and 1612, when Robert Cecil died, already stood before the world as a Protestant power, the only considerable Protestant power in Europe, and all this was but the completion of William Cecil's work. He, more than any other man, had made it possible for the Dutch provinces in the Netherlands to throw over their legitimate Spanish king, and though a very large minority of the Dutch were still Catholic, the new power of Holland stood side by side with England as a Protestant centre. Thus was the great work which William Cecil had set out to do in England and Europe accomplished. On this account, the whole of that decisive period in English history should properly be called the reign of the Cecils. It was they who introduced James I, just as they had introduced Elizabeth, to the throne. It was they who guided and shepherded the nation into the new paths. Such was William Cecil, one of the greatest and certainly one of the vilest of men that ever lived. His work has outlived him and his associates by many hundred years.